Welcome back to Composition and its Allies. My name is Barney. I'm a classical composer, and this is a channel for composers as well as performers that are interested in composition. Recently, I had a video in 2025 called How to Orchestrate Your Piano Sketches, and I showed you some of the theory behind how to actually transform your ideas on piano for full orchestra. Let's start off with the relationship of the harp to the orchestra here. So notice here the harp has the lowest bass note, and that the harp is filling in that middle D that's not present in the orchestral sketch. Not a big problem, and it's part of an arpeggio. Notice as well that the harp extends the ambitus of the orchestra, so the orchestra ends on that F sharp is the highest note, but the harp is going up to a D. So we have the A and the D, which are not present in the orchestra, but that can change, of course. Notice for the left-handed piano, we have, just chords, and already I was thinking trombones. So really important tip is when you're writing the piano sketch, you have to already be thinking for orchestra. Otherwise, you're going to have something really sloppy, and it's going to take a lot of it's just going to be very, very sloppy. So yes, it is very efficient to have a piano score. It gets much quicker. You need it to get to the form and be able to work on the bigger details, but you have to already have certain clear ideas of what the possible orchestration is going to be. If you're not sure if it's going to work, then you have to test it out on a separate piece of paper. For the right hand melody, I'm pretty much sure that I'm hearing this for the violin 1. Now let's look at this example. So we have an issue of balance, right? Because first off, 3 trombones that register, I think they may overpower the violin 1. It depends what else is going on. But for me, a bigger issue that needs to be addressed is the harmony isn't totally clear. Now, yes, we'll still feel that harmony. We still will perceive the overall function of the harmony, but for me, the violin is on the 3rd of the chord. Right? It has a very specific function here. So to deprive it of the full harmonic context within the strings, you're just going to lose some of that luminosity for this orchestration. So certainly when I go to orchestrate it, I want to fill in the fuller harmony with the rest of the strings. Another thing to notice in the piano sketch, we have a doubled third. All right, and my question is this just because of the limitations of what's possible to play, or is it something compositional? Notice as well that the D is not filled in. In this second possibility, I certainly could have filled in the chord. So the fact that I did not choose to fill in that middle D and the fact that I have a double third is probably an indication that I'm hearing this as a compositional effect that needs to be preserved when I orchestrate this. The final thing I want to mention is you may have noticed that there are parallel fifths. And when you are orchestrating or when you're composing your own piece, you can do whatever you want. Okay, it's your style, it's your language, you have your own laws, which you may not consciously be aware of, but we can see them over time. There's consistency in your orchestration and your compositional thinking. So if anyone comes up to you and says, oh, you have parallel fifths in your composition, you can look at them at the fool that they are, because this is composition. This is no longer theory. Now let's get into the orchestration itself. So let's look at the strings. So notice I preserved that double third. So my hunch, which was that it was a true compositional effect. It wasn't just, what was facile, we say in French, easy to play for the piano. It wasn't a compositional effect. So notice I have it in the violin 1, so the top voice in the strings, as well as the viola down the octave. So it's a clear melodic effect. Notice that the cello took the bass note, which makes sense. Notice that I am not doubling the cello down the octave by the double bass. This is a really common thing. It's basically assumed. Obviously, it's hard to do double octaves when you're playing a piano and you have limited space, but this is very often the case that when you orchestrate piano sketches, whatever the bass is going to get doubled down the octave with the double bass and cellos. Not always the case, but it is très courant, as it's in French. It happens all the time. So the fact that I did not double down the octave is an indication that I want something light, and I'm really hearing that specific register. Let's look at the violin too. Notice that they're doing that parallel motion, the parallel fourths. So I talked about in the first half, the parallel fifths and parallel fourths in the music. Notice how it is specifically brought out in the violin too. Also, the most important realization I came to here is notice that that middle D that we talked about that had been left absent in the piano sketch was actually filled in. This brings me to a really important point, is harmony is not just function, okay, it's also the spacing, all right? For example, when you look at some of Debussy's music, if you were to orchestrate, you have to keep everything in the octave that he presented it, especially when it's just three-stage piano, because the harmony is not going to be the same. So when I orchestrated this, to get that effect that I was looking for piano, I had to fill in the D. When I didn't fill in that D, I felt it said, ça sonne un peu creux, say in French. It just felt a little bit empty. So maybe when you're playing on piano and you have a double third and the D wasn't filled in, the homogeneous sound of piano makes it easier to understand. Plus, maybe that double third quality becomes more evident. But when you orchestrate, you have to make certain decisions. And when I orchestrate, I found by putting it in the violins and the violas, I brought the double third effect, but I had to fill in that middle D. Of course, these things can be very subjective, but I'm just trying to show you some of the decisions you really have to make when you orchestrate. If we look at brass and strings together, there's not much I can say yet because it seems that this orchestra is unfinished, because notice that not all the measures are filled in. For me, it's not complete until you have all the rest, filled in, all the notes filled in. But what I can say is these trombones are doing the chords and trumpet is on the melody. Already I'm thinking, is this going to be overstimulated, too many instruments doubling, but it's another issue for another day. Notice that the middle D was not filled in the brass, okay, but again, this is not final. Also notice I tried to add the woodwind, so I was thinking timbrely of the melody, but it's unfinished, and things might have to be lightened up as we go. Now I want to talk about the harp adjustments. So notice that that lower octave from the harp was removed. Okay, and this brings me to what I call the bias of the piano sketch. So when you're orchestrating, you have to be thinking for the orchestra, even when you're using the piano sketch. And I find sometimes we write things on the piano that are easy for our fingers to play, or even if we're still thinking orchestration, like I'm kind of here for orchestra, we end up voicing it in registers that sound pleasurable on the piano, but are not what we actually want for the orchestra. So I don't think there's any way around it. You just have to be aware of it. So let's look at the elevation of the harp. Notice in the piano sketch, its highest note was the D in the staff, but notice in the orchestra realization, the highest note is an A in the staff. So why did it shift? Well, what I can say is when I actually orchestrated, I found I wanted to pop more first and foremost because we have a lot of instruments, but also I wanted a brighter feeling, so I had to extend it to a higher register. Some final thoughts I want to offer you. First off, when you are orchestrating from your piano sketches, you need to have flexibility. So you got to listen for the intended effects, the true effects. So for example, when I pointed out that double third, that feeling of the double third and that parallel motion, when I orchestrated, remember I had to make certain adjustments to get that equivalent effect. Orchestration is not copy and paste. I could not just do it directly, copy and paste. It just wouldn't, it would be something would be missing. Another thing is you have to be ready to shift registers, especially for kind of any accompaniment figure or any kind of soloistic figure if you want a more brilliant orchestration. I hope that this gets you moving on your orchestral work, so I highly suggest now that you shut off YouTube and you go compose or orchestrate your orchestral work. If you've already done that today and you want to take a little bit of break, then you can watch some of the other videos I have on how to orchestrate your piano sketches. Thank you for watching. Have a great day.